It wasn't as if the BBC needed reminding, but tonight the Culture Secretary did so anyway. Can the public trust the nation's biggest cultural institution?
Thank you very much indeed.
The BBC Director General didn't have an entirely easy time of it when he tried to reassure MPs on the subject.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Have you not asked that question?
No, I haven't asked that question.
Are you going to ask that question?
Yes, I will.
Are there any other questions that you would like us to prompt you to ask that you hadn't thought about asking yourself?
Is trust so quickly lost, or indeed quickly recovered? And ought we to change the law to protect children a lot better? The editor of this programme made a mistake in killing an investigation into child abuse by Jimmy Saville, says the man at the very top of the BBC. In the latest session of the BBC's protracted torture, the Director General today confessed to MPs this organisation's shame and embarrassment at what had happened, promised action, and said in so many words that the Newsnight investigation should have gone ahead. There was much more in an appearance for which he had volunteered himself and in which he was obliged to admit serious failings. By common consent, the urgent task is to recover trust. David Grossman watched it all.
The only disagreement whether this is the worst crisis in the BBC's history or simply one of the worst, but there is no doubt that the corporation is being tested. Director General, for just a month, George Entwistle found himself in the, at times, clearly uncomfortable position of being grilled for over 2 hours by MPs who wanted him to account for what had gone on both in the past and the present. The allegations, of course, centre on Jimmy Saville and the now mountain of evidence that he was a predatory paedophile. Mr Entwistle began his evidence expressing regret.
There's no question in my mind that this is what we now know happened is a very, very grave matter indeed. For somebody to have worked for the BBC and at the BBC over a number of decades and to have been responsible for what the police describe as an unprecedented scale of child sexual exploitation there is no question in my mind this is a very grave matter indeed.
But there were clearly many questions that Mr Entwistle couldn't answer.
Who in the BBC decided to bus in young, vulnerable girls from institutions to be in the audience of programmes that were being presented by Jimmy Saville?
I genuinely don't know the answer to that yet. We're trying to pull together all the documentation we can about which managers and so on were in positions of authority at the time Jimmy Saville's programmes were being made, and we are supplying that information to the police so that they know how to take their investigations forward.
But the Director General insisted that new child protection procedures in the corporation meant such unsupervised access could not now happen. Since the story broke, we learned today, the BBC has received allegations not just against Saville, but 9 other current BBC staff or contributors. These involve alleged sexual harassment, assault or inappropriate conduct. Some of these cases, says the BBC, have been referred to the police. Then MPs came to the decision by Newsnight not to run its investigation into Saville. Last night's BBC Panorama aired interviews with Newsnight staff concerned at the decision by Newsnight's editor, Peter Rippon, to end their investigation into Saville, despite their having gathered, in their view, significant and compelling testimony.
Mr Entwistle, do you now accept, in the light of last night's Panorama, that the decision to drop the Newsnight investigation was a catastrophic mistake?
I came away from the Panorama firmly of the view that investigation, even if in the judgment of the editor it wasn't ready for transmission at the point he was looking at it, should have been allowed to continue.
Why did it take 3 weeks for the BBC to realise that the account given by Mr Rippon was inaccurate and incomplete?
When you want to find out why a programme has done an investigation, in my long experience of the BBC, the person you go to is the editor of the programme containing that investigation or the commissioning editor of that investigation, because they are the people, they should know why they commissioned the piece, and they should have the most complete picture of why they commissioned the piece. Now, what became clear to us after the blog was published was that that what had happened on Newsnight was that there was a significant, it seemed, difference of opinion between the people working on the investigation and the editor, Peter Rippon, who commissioned the investigation.
This difference of opinion between the account Peter Rippon gave in his blog and what his staff were saying led to a trawl of emails, leading to the BBC issuing a correcting statement.
I've asked Peter Rippon to step aside because of my disappointment in the nature of the blog and the inaccuracies in the blog.
The final area of questioning was about what the Director-General himself knew.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, all you guys and girls. Welcome indeed to Jim'll Fix It.
One allegation is that the Newsnight investigation was shelved because, as the then head of BBC Television, Mr Entwistle was planning a big Boxing Day tribute to Jimmy Savile.
Good morning, did you see the
Mr Entwistle said he first was told about the investigation by the BBC's Director of News, Helen Bowden.
The substance of the conversation was that Helen said to me, I wanted to tell you, this is to the best of my recollection because this is a conversation a long time ago. I wanted to tell you that Newsnight are looking at Jimmy Savile or investigating Jimmy Savile, and if it comes off, if it stands up, words to that effect, it may have an impact on your Christmas schedule. And I said, well, thanks for letting me know. Please update me. And what I meant by that was on whether or not it will be going ahead.
You're told that one of the flagship investigative programmes on the BBC is looking into one of the most iconic figures who you are about to commission huge tributes to, and you don't want to know what it is?
It wasn't that I didn't want to know. What was in my mind was this determination not to show an undue interest.
But just saying, thanks, Helen, what are you looking at? I mean, why did she tell you if you were determined not to ask what it was about? She presumably thought you should know, and therefore would have expected you at least to say, really, that's interesting, what is it about?
I assumed she was preparing me, as indeed she was, for the possibility that I would need to think about changing the schedule, and it was that information I took from the conversation.
The Director-General left the committee with still many questions unanswered. 2 reviews already in place may answer some, but the big question, what this affair will do to public trust in the BBC, will perhaps take longer to become clear.
Well, no one from the BBC's senior management wanted to join us tonight. Instead, we have 3 people who do or have worked for the BBC. Ben Bradshaw, the former Culture Secretary and member of today's Select Committee, and a former member of the BBC staff, BBC reporter. Rod Little of The Spectator, who was the editor of the Today programme, and Liz Kershaw, who still presents for Radio 6 Music. Ben Bradshaw, this question of trust is the key to the whole thing. Does the public have confidence in the BBC? How much danger is it in, do you think?
It's in a lot of danger, not least because of the basic scandal of Jimmy Savile and child abuse, but also the way the BBC has handled it. I don't think it's irreparable, but I think George Entwistle needs to get a grip. He needs to assemble the facts, he needs to make himself confident in those facts, and he needs to act on them, and quickly.
Do you feel from what you saw today that George Entwistle is the man to restore confidence?
It didn't appear so today. I mean, you have to feel a little bit sorry for the bloke in that he's only been in the job a short time, and that he has to wander before a bunch of well-trained these days MPs on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. But there are 2 problems, and I think one of them is, I think the Director-General looks as if he's guilty of hanging the editor of Newsnight out to dry, much as indeed some members of your staff are hanging the editor of their programme out to dry, which I don't think is very pleasant. He says the
decision was his alone.
Yeah, well, you see, the problem for Entwistle is he orders this inquiry, which is to be unbiased and unpartisan, to look into what happened, and then before the MPs he dobs Entwistle in. He says he was
Rippon. You're talking.
Yeah, Rippon. He says that Peter Rippon should have run that programme. How does he know? He hasn't seen the programme.
Continued with it. He didn't say run it.
But he hasn't seen the programme.
Let me just bring in Liz Kershaw. I mean, I know you're a long way away in New York, but I mean, do you think public confidence is being eroded in the BBC?
Well, definitely back home, but I can say here, no, when I was entering through immigration and customs, I was asked what I did for a job, and I said I work for the BBC, and the guy said, "Oh, I love Poirot and Morse. You're in." And I didn't like to say they're ITV actually, in case I got shoved to the back of the queue. And I asked a friend today, "Is this Savile thing getting a lot of coverage?" And I was told, "No, it's not like he's in Downton Abbey, Jimmy Savile, is it? Nobody knows who he is." So we're okay on a global scale, but back home, I think people are definitely suspicious.
Can I just pick up on something Rod said? Because Rod accused George Entwistle of hanging Peter Rippon out to dry. Peter Rippon published a misleading and incomplete account of his reasons for dropping the Newsnight investigation. I think any Director General in that position would feel very let down, as I think George Entwistle does feel let down.
But he went further than that. I mean, and he said that there's to be this unbiased inquiry into what happened. The other two important points, and this is where the trouble might lie in the future, is that I just find it very, very difficult to accept that there was no pressure whatsoever on Rippon because of those two emails, which we now know about. One from Liz McKean to her friend, which said which had Peter Rippon quoted as saying there is a long political chain attached to this, and the other statement to Myriam Jones, which was the bosses aren't very happy. Why would he say that if there were not some form, possibly entirely justifiable interference?
Well, we hope that whatever happens in the inquiry, that is found out one way or another.
Yeah. Well,
that's
sure.
the whole point of having one, isn't it?
But at the moment, it seems to be prejudged that Rippon's stepped. I don't know what stepped aside means entirely. I mean, you might know. He's your boss.
I don't know either. I mean, I assume it's voluntary as an alternative to it being compulsory. I don't know. I don't understand. But as far as the general public are concerned, that is one small aspect of the story, isn't it? Does this perpetual spectacle of day after day, the BBC beating itself up, do anything to help matters?
No, and that's why I think George Entwistle needs to get a grip, assemble the facts and act on those facts. I don't think we can wait for the outcome of this independent Pollard review, because the longer the story is about the BBC's handling of this, the more it's not about the victims, them getting their voice heard and them getting justice, about the real scandal, which was how Jimmy Savile and possibly others managed to abuse them with impunity over decades.
That's the important thing in all of this, isn't it?
Of course it is, but the tailspin was caused by the bureaucrats not knowing how to handle what was actually quite a simple issue. You know, there's nothing particularly wrong with an editor saying, I don't like that piece, it's not running, nor indeed with a senior manager saying, are you running this piece on Jimmy Savile? We've got something coming up. You know, that's perfectly reasonable. It's the tailspin, it's the denial, it's the hiding away, it's the false statements. That's what undermines trust. And of course, you're right. It gets so boring. It must be boring for you every night to be asking yourself.
It's only Tuesday too.
Indeed.
Now, Liz Kershaw, George Entwistle today broadened this. I mean, he apologised profusely for stuff which didn't happen on his watch a long time ago, and it was really in your end of the business, in the pop end of things. And he then went on to say that there was an ongoing investigation into, I think he said, 9 people for sexual harassment and possible assault and that sort of thing. Now, has the culture changed in your end of the business?
To some extent. I have to say that I was really impressed when I went to see George Entwistle, because he was very honest with me and said, Liz, I don't know anything really about radio. I don't know anything about Radio 1 and its culture down the decades, and he was very interested in what I had to say. He obviously was keen to get any help he could, and this did shock me, with assembling a cast of characters at the time. You know, it amazed me that it seemed he was saying there was no formal record within the BBC of who was managing Radio 1 at the time, who the producers were, who the executives were, who the controller was. I wrote down a list of names for him, and he went through and said, is this guy still alive? Oh, this guy's name's come up a lot. Tell me more about him. Liz, and he said to me, I want to get to the bottom of this culture.
Did he call you?
No, after I'd appeared on the Today programme, I got a series of calls from all the layers of management in the BBC, and I've had experience of that before, and I said, no, I'm not doing this. I want to speak to George Entwistle, and he saw me.
This was when you recounted how you had been groped on air by a fellow DJ.
That was one of the things I recounted to the Today programme. What I was saying, and it was heavily edited, was that there was endemic sexism. I never said that mine was a sexual assault or sexual harassment. I was saying there was endemic sexism, and if you were a woman, the way that they kept you in your place was to, you know, use your gender against you. That's the point I was trying to make.
It has changed, hasn't it? At least I hope it's changed.
Yes, it's changed, but it's still a problem, I think, that's a legacy of that. And George Entwistle is aware of that, and I was really inspired by his comments that he's going to look into how women in radio, particularly, are still treated because, for example, I don't want to bore you with facts, but only 17% of presenters on the BBC's big 3 music stations are women. There hasn't been a woman on daytime Radio 2 for 17 years. And, you know, only 26% of output by local radio is by females.
Okay,
and there isn't one BBC, can I just make this? There isn't one BBC breakfast show in the country, 54 of them presented by a woman. Okay, and that's what he said he'd look at.
Now, Ben Bradshaw.
But perhaps if somebody had spoken to Liz McKean as they spoke to this Liz, the BBC might not be in the crisis it is now. But I want to say one other thing, which is, in one of the things that Peter Rippon said, he said, when he decided
the
editor of Newsnight, when he decided to junk the investigation, he referred to the evidence being weak because we only had the women. Only the women. Now, this is toxic. This is, I'm afraid, been totally fatal for him.
That is hypersensitive.
How can you refer to only the women?
Well, let me answer. Let me answer. He
could have used only the victims, couldn't he?
He could have done. He didn't. He said
he
only
the women who appeared in
and
the
there were more
film.
women than he fessed up to.
But we're going to explore this question of child protection in a moment or two, but in the meantime it raises another question, is whether people can believe BBC News anymore.
Well, I think there are questions for BBC News, and I agree with Rod on this. I think the outstanding questions from George Entwistle's evidence today was serious questions for BBC News management. What were the people doing who were in between George Entwistle at the top and Peter Rippon as editor of Newsnight? Lots of questions about that, still not resolved.
Do you believe it?
Yes, I do generally believe it, but 2 things will come out of this, and you know what they are, and I know what they are. One, if editors have any sense, never ever refer up in the BBC. It'll be trouble. But more than that, once this inquiry is out of the way, what will happen at the end is that it will be much, much more difficult to do the sort of journalism which you lot were doing, because people will be far more cautious as a consequence.
OK, thank you all very much. Now, the most sickening aspect of this whole debacle is the attitude which seems to have been taken by some authority figures that victims of abuse aren't necessarily to be taken seriously because, well, essentially because they're victims. The number of children said to have been abused, a figure which seems to grow daily, points up the problem of identifying offenders before they attack again. Might it be better to adopt the system in place in the USA, Australia and Ireland and make it an offence not to report allegations or incidents of sexual exploitation? Jim Reid reports.
There were 200 potential victims, dozens of witnesses, yet Jimmy Saville managed to live to 84 without being arrested. The abuse took place not just at the BBC, but in hospitals and children's homes across the country. So why didn't anyone report it? Why didn't those witnesses come forward?
I'm finding that a lot of schools and institutions, such as the BBC, would much rather hide the abuse and allow the abuser to continue rather than actually report it, because of course then it would damage their reputation. We've got no clearer evidence of that than the recent trouble we've had with Jimmy Saville.
There are, of course, safeguards in place meant to protect young people. Any organisation that works with children has to put in place a child protection policy. The local authority should be told if an allegation of sexual abuse is made, or if there's a risk a child may be harmed. But in Britain, there is no legal duty to report that abuse, either to the police or to social services. The answer, some say, is to compel witnesses to come forward, to make it a criminal offence not to pass on those allegations to the authorities. Last week, 32 child protection groups, barristers and church leaders wrote to The Times calling for that change in the law. They want to see mandatory reporting of child abuse allegations, as is already the case in the US, Canada, Australia and Ireland.
If we had mandatory reporting, we would, obviously, all abusers would be identified before they could continue their abuse. And we know that child abusers very rarely only abuse once. Child abuse happens in institutions nationwide, and without mandatory reporting, we can't possibly know the scale of it.
Many victims and other campaigners say a similar system in the UK would give people more confidence to come forward. We spoke to one teacher who said her complaints about a fellow member of staff were not passed on by the school to the authorities.
I followed the correct procedure, which was to report this to the designated person that every school has. Over time, I began to suspect that it hadn't been reported to the local authority. It's almost seen as a bad thing to report something. There's a culture of just covering things up and burying your head in the sand and hoping it will go away.
But there are strong arguments against any change in the law. Last year, Eileen Munro chaired a wide-ranging government review of child protection.
We have a strong culture within organisations that they should make reports, and we have statutory guidance that says they have a duty to make reports and that they should have a policy within any organisation that has contact with children to help people talk through, is this something to worry about, and then to know how to report it. So our system is ending up with about the same rate of referrals as the countries with mandatory reporting. So there is no statistical evidence to suggest that we are missing more serious cases than in the countries with mandatory reporting.
Large children's charities are also against any change in the law. The NSPCC claims there's no solid evidence that mandatory reporting works, and it might just clutter up the system with extra unproven allegations. Newsnight understands, though, that the organisation may now conduct a review of that position in the light of the Saville scandal. And the experience of mandatory reporting in other countries has been mixed at best. In Australia, critics of the law say it's led to a huge increase in abuse cases, overwhelming the child protection system and taking resources away from other areas of social work like family support. Child protection workers on both sides of the argument agree on one thing. More does need to be done to change the culture of reporting abuse.
I think there's a certain amount of crowd mentality. There's the sense with the Saville case, it appears as if a large number of people knew about it. So any one individual would have thought, well, others know about it and they haven't done anything, so perhaps I shouldn't. You know, there's that research of somebody on the street having been injured and people walk past and other people then walk past. We end up behaving with immense callousness because we're following the crowd behaviour.
Do you think the culture of society has changed since 1975?
It's certainly changing for the better, but I think we should not feel smug. There's still a lot of progress that needs to be made.
The world may have changed since Saville ruled the airwaves, but today victims and witnesses say they are still often treated with suspicion as accusers and troublemakers.
So, do we do enough to protect the most vulnerable in our society? Camilla Batman-Gellett of the Kids Company is here. Claire Fox of the Institute of Ideas is also here. What do you think of this idea, Camilla?
Well, I would think it was quite a good idea if I believed our systems could cope with it. But right now, our child protection system is completely at breaking point. You just have to look at the fact that Birmingham has failed as a child protection social services, and then there are others who've failed. And then if you get this kind of mandatory reporting happening as well, the whole system will completely collapse.
But in principle you're in favour of it, it's just a case of the mechanics being adequate.
Yeah, I think in general we have to look at the issue of vulnerable children in this country, and our politicians need to stand up and have a vision in relation to issues of child protection in this country.
Now, Claire Fox, you don't think it's a desirable thing?
No, I mean, I think it's worth saying that I don't think that child sexual abuse is rife, and I do not think that it's on the rise. And actually, I'm very nervous about the climate at the moment that is kind of ratcheting up the discussion because of what's happened around one very nasty, horrible case, the Jimmy Saville case. Mandatory reporting, it would be in danger of effectively having every rumour, every suspicion go to the authorities. And I think that that will create a climate of finger-pointing. Every adult interaction with a child could potentially be seen in a very
but as against that, you have a pattern of repeat behaviour by these people.
Yeah,
if you can get the first case on a file somewhere, doesn't it save other children?
I think that there is a serious danger of taking this case, and because of a variety of people ratcheting it up and a kind of, bloodlust in the air.
It's a witch, there's a danger of a witch hunt.
Instead of the very serious case of protecting children, what we're going to do is do children a great disservice. Because now, and we've already heard it on this programme this evening, we conflate a whole range of different things. Sexism in the BBC, the lack of female presenters.
That was really confused, all of that, I agree.
But it was also in the inquiry today.
It was the Director General who conflated the two.
I do actually think that child abuse is a serious problem in this country. The Children's Commissioner is about to release a report describing wide-scale abuse of girls in street gangs. We have to redefine our child abuse in this country is no longer limited to families. It's quite endemic in certain areas, and it has to be addressed.
We've already got to a situation in this country where parents are frightened to let their children out to play.
Listen, that's a different argument. You can't use that argument.
Camilla, I am allowed to use the argument I use. You can't tell me what argument I can use. Right, let me finish it then.
You go ahead and finish it, but I think you're wrong.
And teachers in schools are frightened to let parents take photos in sports days. We've got criminal records checks, which effectively meant that you had to have a licence to work with children. Voluntary organisations frightened to work with.
This is not an
argument
because
Camilla, it's an argument you disagree with. That doesn't make it flawed.
Believe
it or not,
you're
there are two sides to this argument.
A normal situation, which is adults being with children, and you're saying that because there are allegations around that the issue of child protection.
And I'm suggesting that unless we calm down.
Listen, we agreed that we were going to let me speak next. Yeah. Okay. There is an issue here, which is that there is a problem with child protection in this country. It doesn't mean that adults being with children in a perfectly okay way should be addressed in an accusatory manner, but nevertheless there is a problem in this country and we're blind to it. When in Rochdale the police and social services are describing girls who are being sexually abused as making a lifestyle choice, it's a problem.
I do not think society should be reorganised.
The question here is about how one protects children, and part of that has to be, has it not, to do with the belief, the credibility that's attached to accounts these children give time after time. And it's happened in this latest BBC business. There is some question mark placed over the testimony of the victims precisely because they're victims. Now, how do you get around that?
Right, we have to be very careful as well that we don't say people have the right to be listened to and believed per se. You have to bear in mind that when people say something happened, you have to then see whether you make a decision about whether you proceed with it. Because, for example, just to use that example, children can say all sorts of things, adults can say all sorts of things. There's a lot of rumours on Twitter at the moment about all sorts of people. Do you want to live in a society where rumour and finger-pointing, where people who say, I am a victim, means that the police have to be reported to, that everything has to be acted on, that we look at each other all the time as though something terrible is occurring? So the very serious instance, in the very minor instances that they happen of child abuse, are going to be drowned out by an absolute clamouring of people not even knowing what we're meant to be pointing our fingers at.
One child being abused is one too many. You cannot call it minor. It's a problem because there's an endemic power imbalance. Children cannot hold adults accountable for their safety. Adults do have to take that responsibility. We're not taking that responsibility.